Go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my individual inquiry. Let's pause for a second and enjoy the serenity of this picture. I imagine you as the person on the boat who will be joining me on my island to learn about my individual inquiry, but I'm hoping that you're able to take some of my learnings and bring it back to your island. But before you go and leave my island, I would love to learn about things that you learned, the philosophies and strategies that was outlined in this, in this discussion, and learn how you're going to use it so I can learn better in the future. So let's begin and talk about my inquiry. And so my inquiry question is, what instructional philosophies and strategies can I use to move from a classroom based on fear to building a technology education learning environment for students to learn to be good global citizens and also to learn good morals? Anytime I put a blob of text, I always want to have some images. So my inquiry in picture form is, how can we move from the photo on the left to that photo on the right? And anytime that I include a photo, there's usually an article associated with it, and those articles are generally worth reading, and I do highlight the ones at the end in my references for things that I think are interesting. And so this kind of talks about social pressures and cheating, and then this other article is just beautiful, and it actually explains this photo, and I'm going to explain this photo as part of the discussion of the strategies and philosophies that I'm going to use in the classroom. And so to answer the question, how am I going to move from a fear-based classroom to one to teach students good morals and to be good global citizens, the answer is threefold. The answer is, one, myself as the teacher has to become the student, basically become the student that participates in the learning. The second one is that you have to have a essential source of knowledge that students can draw from. And the third is that people have to understand their consequences towards society to create something called transcension. And I'm going to explain transcension and how transcension kind of allows you to have a mentality that goes beyond pedagogy and some of the other educational oddities. And so all of that will make a lot more sense as I start to do that discussion. But I wanted to also talk about how I got to that conclusion. And so as part of my individual inquiry, I entered deep into the warren. For those of you who don't know what a warren is, it's kind of that overused analogy of a rabbit's burrow. And so I came to that conclusion of those three potential philosophies and all the associated strategies. So I'll go into exactly how I'm going to use that in the technological education classroom. But to get to that discovery, I basically took I dug three routes deep into the warren. And so the three routes, they all involve studying the indigenous. But the first one was studying the indigenous of North America. The second was studying the indigenous of my culture, which is Goa in India. And the third is also in studying the indigenous of Africa, which is also partly my culture too, because of the way that my family moved around. And so I'm going to go into some of the philosophies of each of those three indigenous groups and then outline some of those strategies. And then I'm also going to outline the next steps, which are learn about other indigenous groups. And I also do a lot of interpretation of folk music, folk art, and trying to identify ways to learn from the indigenous, which I can definitely do a better job. And then the third next step is, as I go through this process of inquiry, I'm going to want to evaluate if I'm using these teachings and learnings within my classroom, learn more strategies, and kind of go full circle. And so kind of let's exit the burrow for now. Let's actually learn about some of these teachings and some of these learnings. And so sort of the motivation behind it is I was invited last year to give a safety talk about kiteboarding and bird watching in extreme weather and cold water. And so as part of Truth and Reconciliation, I wanted to draw from the knowledge base of the Indigenous North Americans. And it kind of troubled me because when I looked for references, I actually only found ones that were literally written by colonialists. And so while the knowledge was there, the teachings and learnings through observation were there of those people, it was actually written by colonialists. And so I really wanted to learn how to properly learn from the Indigenous, and was a huge part of this individual inquiry. And so one of the things that I found, I wanted to share this before I started my actual inquiry, because it's the approach that I used, kind of follows the Indigenous research paradigm, which is an ethical way. And it's not the study of people and communities, but it's actually standing with them. So I like this. I don't use that much art in this talk. And so I like this one. It's like, don't do this beam up and study of or on. Actually just learn through observation, have conversations, participate in events. I spoke with people, both the Chippewa of Rama, as well as the Six Nations of the Grand River and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also, talked to my parents and family members to learn about things from Goa, and also about things from Africa. And that was the general approach that I used. And I just wanted to outline that, as I start this talk. It's very important that Indigenous research paradigm is outlined, and it is outlined in this paper as well. Great. And so let's begin with first learning about some of the teaching and learning philosophies from the Indigenous of North America. And so a lot of my individual inquiry was actually drawn from the doctoral thesis of Professor Cormier, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Lakehead University. And so you're going to notice within this individual inquiry, I'm going to do quotes of quotes from research papers, from theses, from publications that I found. And then I'm going to apply those quotes, both the philosophy and the strategies, to how I'm going to use it in the classroom. And so one of the first things is just like, what is knowledge? And so I love this quote, which is originally from Peter Christmas, who was an elder of Professor Cormier's, group, and it's, knowledge is a gift from the Creator that belongs to all people. You are simply a transmitter of ideas. Individuals don't own ideas; they belong to people. People make them a reality. Back to that imagery on the boat, entering my island. Like me alone having my individual inquiry research doesn't mean anything. It's only if I'm able to share it with others. They're able to use it. They're able to give me feedback. We're able to learn together. This concept of people and what entails people is a huge thing, which is shown across all of the Indigenous learning. That's like foreshadowing what I'm basically going to tell you about in my inquiry. And so let's begin by, I'm just going to try to do the best I can to summarize his thesis dissertation. I highly recommend that you read it. There are 5 chapters, and I'll just take some of the key concepts from each chapter. I obviously couldn't summarize everything. I can't quote everything, but I did my best to take the things that I can directly apply to my classroom. And so the first thing that I learned is conflict prevents learning. The quote is, change is constant, and therefore its vector of change is critical to consider, and one cannot move towards peaceful relations without first moving towards peace within. That's really well outlined in the chapter of that thesis, which leads to the second chapter. In the second chapter, there's the concept that current fear-based systems of learning and education do not work. So as a primary tool of state, the formal education system is heavily implicated in the facilitation of cognitive imperialism. Formal education is a machine operating on pain and suffering of many populations. When you have fear, parts of your brain shut down and you're unable to learn. So we have to move to a system beyond fear. And how do we do that? And that kind of brings the concept of holism, and that's the first philosophy that I learned and wanted to share, and also how some strategies that are going to apply to my classroom. So first, what is holism? Holism is circle teachings. All experiences of the individual are seen in the light of 4 aspects of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. This concept is called holism and goes beyond the individual to create a deep connection to family, community, nation, as well as to environment, land, water, air. So that's the first concept. In the Ontario curriculum, Section C talks about society, but it's kind of the section after knowledge and skills. I think teachers focus on the knowledge and skills part of the curriculum and don't incorporate section C and sections D until much later. As an educator in the technology classroom, I want to incorporate section C up front. It gets paired with skills and knowledge. Every skill, every sort of knowledge, every sort of skill that a student gains has an implication towards society, and that has to come up front. And there are many different ways to do that, but just a reminder to the students of what they're learning and where it's going to be used is very, very important. And so that's one of the first strategies that I'm going to take to my classroom, drawing from holism. The second philosophy that he goes over is up the top there. I don't actually know how to pronounce this. And the translation that his mother and the elders offered was, they are learning with each other while they are doing. And he calls it the Indigenous Living Peace Methodology. What's very interesting is this philosophy actually has two constituent parts that have two separate meanings, but together have a third meaning of its own. That's like synergy, basically. And so I want to talk about the first constituent part, which means learning with others, which also has an exact translation of teaching with each other. And so they have the same meaning for the same words, have two different meanings in English. And so what that means is it incorporates that not only from one another, but also from people and land and the spirit. Teaching and learning go hand in hand, and other is not just human beings, but it's also environment and the spirit. And I think that's really huge. And so one of the themes you're going to learn about is how I go from being a teacher to also being a learner, in the same way the students are going to be teachers and the students are going to be learners. And I'll talk what that means, and you're going to notice the same concept within the other indigenous knowledge groups that I've inquired about. And so the second part to it is while they are doing. So you are learning by doing while they are doing. Very interesting. If you read chapter 3 of his thesis, he offers the fasting ceremony as an example of while they are doing, which is very interesting because if you read what it is, you're isolated from all human contact with exception of one-on-one guidance from an elder. And so while they are doing, by you going through a process of individual inquiry, by sharing that knowledge with others, are you all able to learn? And so it's turning individualism into collectivism. That's a key philosophy within this mindset and can be also used in the classroom. Students can learn on their own. They can help others. They can share what they learn, and they can build a central knowledge base. All things that I plan to incorporate within my classroom. Then he also talks about, the place where he is from and the narrative and the stories behind that. And so it's an Ojibwe term meaning the place where the pipestone comes from. That's actually the region that he's from. And he talks about how the pipe is sacred, how all sacred acts could not take place without the pipe. And he talks about how that spiritually connects you with all things and the Creator. And there's a lot of significance around the pipe, both like circular teachings as well as what red signifies. I can't justify doing a good job of explaining it. Just like please read the sources that I reference for some of these images. Very, very interesting stuff that's outlined there. But what I did want to interpret a little bit more is something else that is offered, which is the significance of the drum. I believe I can do that because I learned about it within my own cultural Goa as well as Africa. And so I just wanted to explain what I learned from the North Americans, which is the tool that makes the heart sound. And so the drum is a tool to connect to the Creator, Mother Earth, and all our relations. It is believed that peace and contentment can be achieved through synchronicity with the drum. And it kind of brings the idea of a drum circle or multiple people feeding the drum or feasting the drum and working together. Again, circular synchronicity is a very important concept. It's the same way by creating a rhythm that students are able to learn and contribute. They're all kind of joining in on this journey, which I think is really, really awesome. And if you want to learn more, there's a great interview that's also outlined from this picture. It's a video, and it explains how In Ojibwe culture, the drum is considered a person, and it should be treated as a sacred person. Drums eat, and they can also be feasted. And there's this concept of feasting the drum, and that's done as a group. Very, very, very interesting and directly applicable to the classroom. And that kind of leaves the final chapter of his thesis, which kind of talks about a complex indigenous conflict system. A metaphor is made to peeling the onion, where the problem is at the center, but the world is on the outside, and it's not just two-dimensional; it's n-dimensional. It's represented in three-dimensionally here. The world is far away from your problem, but you can solve your problem locally while thinking globally. And again, that chapter really goes over the philosophies around that. But taking that back to the classroom and summarizing it, it's like, hey, there is a greater world around these students, and students understand that by solving the problem, they can incorporate the teachings of the world, and they can draw from a larger funnel of knowledge to come to a very simple solution, an elegant solution. I think that's a really cool thing to do, again, drawing from the curriculum, society, and implications of what they're doing, and allowing students to understand and evaluate those things are going to be a very important part to my classroom. And so part of this is, and this is like indigenous text in general, is peace is a lifelong journey. And the culture of land is its most critical component. And, in his culture, he says, and he ends his thesis this way: I can choose to be assimilated into the culture of violence within the academy, or like ni, which I believe translates to water. I can live in peace. Also, it's not a direct translation. You should read the thesis to better understand it. But, within the academy, or I can live in peace. I can help others. I can forgive. I can learn my culture, and I can choose to be happy. And so he ended his thesis on a way that I can actually draw from, which is I need to learn my culture, and I can choose to be happy. And kind of that naturally transitions into the next part of my individual inquiry, which is of those teachings. So to summarize, the concept of holistic learning, of learning and teaching is the same, learning as a community and connecting to society, are those same concepts within the indigenous of Goa, India, which is where ethnically I am from. And that was the next step on the journey. So definitely pause the video. That was a lot of stuff. Pause the video, take a pause. Let's now move on to discussing the indigenous of Goa, some of the teachings and learnings of those, both colonial and pre-colonial Portuguese. And so if you thought I was done quoting his thesis, I'm not. There is an awesome 2 quotes. I did not know that I am Indian. I wasn't always an Indian. He, in his thesis at the start, talks about his journey to identify within his own culture. Using the word Indian, he uses it in a different way. I use it in the way of belonging to India. So Goa is part of the Indian subcontinent, but as a child, I was always thought that Goa was its own country because it was, colonized by the Portuguese. It had its own language and culture. I got invited in 2018 to do a program called No Goa, where the government brought young people from around the world, diaspora youth of Goan origin, to learn about our origin, to learn about our roots. And so this photo is taken at the governor of Goa's house, and it's the constituent class of the North Americans. So there are 3 Canadians, including me, and 1 American who kind of was joined this delegation. And we got to learn about our culture. And one of the things that we learned is actually on what colonial Portuguese brought to Goa and what it took away. And so that's part of this inquiry that I had to do is there were some papers written by one of the professors who spoke to us that first night about folk song and folk music and why it's important. And I further investigated both their papers as well as folk art and folk music and how it draws back to that original inquiry question. How can we move from fear to in a learning environment, that allows us to connect to society. And so, yeah, let's get into it. So a little bit of a history lesson. Portuguese came to Goa in the 1500s. They took over various parts through battles and through alliances. This is mostly depicted again by colonial art. So this is, a painting of a battle between the Turks and the Portuguese ships. You can also notice that the Portuguese, they had slaves of different origins who would take them around. And again, a lot of this I'm drawing from is by these artistic portrayals of life in India, specifically the Goan contexts of the Portuguese, and that's from 1540. And so you'll see a juxtaposition of a Hindu marriage versus a Portuguese soldier, proposing his hand for marriage. Completely different. You'll notice the symbolisms of the drums and dance and music. And then the other thing that I found really eye-opening is that when the Portuguese came, one hand was out for marriage, the other hand was still holding the sword. It's a very powerful metaphor. The sword is not drawn, but the sword is still there. And so this concept is actually very few Portuguese actually married Goans. A lot of the ethnicity remained within Goa. They actually just baptized Goans, and we took their Catholic surname. So my last name, Andrade, it was actually de Andrade, which means from Andrade. So my godfather, so if you go back to my paternal side, my godfather was Portuguese, but I'm actually of Hindu origin. And so they actually have depictions of what they call the Conquerors, Gentiles. And they also had like other Goans. You'll notice they depict the locals always with arms in hand. And so there was this concept of crossfire where Goans would fight against other Goans siding with the Portuguese or not. And so being part of colonial Portugal, things were brought to the Goans and things were removed from the Goans. And one thing I want to talk about on things being brought is this concept of passing the pipe, which I think is really, really cool. It's like there are two separate accounts of the Portuguese introducing tobacco to India, which created the Indian pipe. And it's kind of metaphorical to very similar to those concepts that I spoke about, the indigenous of North America, that some traditions might have been brought on by the Portuguese, but some of those traditions were also removed. And that's kind of that concept of the drum, and I'll talk about that. So this is a nice depiction. It looks like a pipe. I actually don't think it is a pipe. I think he's blowing air into the fire for metalworking. One of the things that the Portuguese did was they prevented everyone from doing metalcraft. They only let the Brahmins or the upper class to actually forge metal to create weapons, and they were able to gain control by limiting and destroying parts of their culture. And that's kind of where the movement of Gandhi came from, which is like, one India, we can do whatever we need to do. It's the same kind of concept on this colonial is like restrict what people can learn, make them specialized so that they can't be broad and they're unable and they're reliant on others. And that goes back to the classroom. It's like students, and we're going to talk about this in depth, is like students should not be reliant on the teachers for learning. Students should be their own teachers and engage in their own learning. And so that's like one of those concepts that I'm going to speak about a little bit more in depth. And I thought that this painting basically, or this folk art basically depicted that extremely well, and it resonated with me. And so this professor that I spoke about who talked to us, their surname is Kamat. And so their kind of research was in, let's look at these folk songs and outline the historical context behind them. And so they talk about the different type of folk music, and there's a song style called the Mondo. And so the Mondo style is the biography of a Goan. The image on the right is by one of my favorite cartoon artists from Goa. He's called Billy Tunes. Casa Goa means Goa, my home. And you'll notice that drum at the center of the home and music being, a very important part of culture within Goa. And so if you really read into some of the papers written by this professor, you can actually learn a lot about the culture. And what's very interesting is the word Mondo actually can have a Portuguese root, which means order or command, and it has a violence-based context. But if you actually look at the etymology, which is really challenging because this reference is not even in English, and it actually comes from a Konkani verb. Konkani is the mother tongue of my mother, actually. So that's like the local language that she would speak. There isn't an actual script. They either use like the Hindi Sanskrit or they use the English script, but there's very little written Konkani. But it comes from the verb manduk, which means to arrange. And it actually has an African extraction of a Sanskrit root tongue twister, sorry, which is this word here, which I can't pronounce, which means songs of movement. And again, it goes to that concept of nonviolence. By just beating a drum and by being in unison, you can actually create movement, which is really cool. Again, it foreshadows some of the concepts in Africa. So basically, the apartheid in South Africa was this nonviolent action. This reference also talks about how it also stemmed from a Gandhian movement and an Indian movement as well. Also very interesting. I will go into depth on the African Indigenous and their philosophies and how I can take that to the classroom. Before I do that, I want to draw something new from what I learned of Goan heritage. So I found a lot of similarities with what I learned of the Indigenous. And to draw something new, I wanted to talk about a recent paper that was published that talks about deschooling. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, India was shut down. And this government provided a central resource for students to learn. And I thought that was a solution, right? If we have a central resource everyone can learn from, well, we actually need accommodations, right? There's marginalized sections like tribal students who can't access these online resources. The question that they try to answer is like, was it equal and accessible to all? Probably not. What kind of arrangements could have been equitable? Well, they referenced this concept of deschooling by a priest named Ivan Illich. And so Ivan Illich was a priest of Austrian descent who basically wrote a book called Deschooling Society. And I definitely didn't have time to read the full book, but I did read some chapter summaries and some blog posts about it. This is a great blog which talks about the counterfactual. So what are schools today? There's grade worship. There's conformity, dependence, and delusion. And I love this quote, which is there any wonder that our school systems produce so many humans, and I include myself in this bracket, who struggle to live within the societies we are building? To the opposite on the right, which is what is proposed in Deschooling Society. And so this is where I could draw directly to the classroom. And so they kind of offer this concept of learning webs or learning circles or learning networks, and has 4 components. Reference service to educational objects. So you can do what they did in India, create a central resource that all students can reference. But that alone is not enough. There has to be skill exchange. So students have to teach students things that they know and learn from others. And there's the skill exchange paired with peer matching, which is pretty interesting, right? So students working with other students. And then reference to educators at large. They're going to be educators that are more skilled at a certain thing than just the peers, and so you kind of need to go beyond your local community, and that kind of brings it back to the benefit of society. Really interesting book, at least from the chapter summaries that I've read. I did want to quote something. I did read some of the book. I did want to quote directly from the book, which is, the inverse of school is possible. We can depend on a self-motivated learning. Instead of employing teachers to bribe or compel the student to find time and will to learn, that we can provide the learner with new links to the world instead of continuing to funnel all educational programs to the teacher. So in this book, he talks about going beyond pedagogy. That's something that I'm going to discuss also in depth, which comes from the Indigenous Africans, going beyond pedagogy and talking about huology, which is the self-motivated learning. And we're gonna get really into the depths of that. But basically, the concept is we have to use these kind of different methods to engage students into the real world and enable them to be self-motivated to learn and teach. And that is how we kind of can move forward. And so there's this concept, again, another great pictorial here. This is another research paper which talks about the different levels of education. And so pedagogy is at the base. It's very important. It's foundational. It engages students. But eventually we have to move to andragogy, cultivation, the learning. It's the study of adults learning. And then going to huology, which is the self-motivation or the study of self-motivated learning. And we're going to talk about the transition past this triangle as well, and I'll explain what that means. There's something above this triangle that we can work towards. But first, how do you get self-directed learning? Single loop learning is in pedagogy. So you have a problem, action, outcomes. Teacher evaluates, students work towards it. The main thing is to go beyond it. You have to go to the belief system. And by, questioning their own beliefs, are people able to learn and teach more effectively. And then I'm going to draw a similarity to a book that was published by the same author, that same priest, basically talking about some of the problems in healthcare, but I'm just going to change it to a teaching context. So within the last decade of the teaching professional practice has become a major threat to learning. Depression, disability, dysfunction, other diseases cause more suffering. So students, there's a little bit of disservice currently, right? And so what happens is in the current teaching practice, there's this reinforcement of trends to current society and solves problems in a cybernetic or a robotic way. If the curriculum doesn't adapt, if we aren't able to meet the needs of students and change, we're just going to be doing it in sort of a robotic way. And so in the same way, teaching professionals can have an indirect sickening power, structurally denying students' ability to learn. And that's kind of the parallels that I draw to the healthcare system. The reason that I do that is because I also found a separate paper that talks about it. But before I get there, I thought this Goan comic was relevant, which is, before I take up your case, I'd like to feel your purse. I mean your pulse. So there's this idea of money that's sort of behind some of the motivations and can prevent teaching good morals. And that kind of goes back to problems with the education system, problems with the healthcare system. And so how can that be drawn back to the research question? Well, I found this paper, adequately titled Nursing Education, What Fits Best in a Changing World of Education Gauges. So we talked about the different educational gauges. And what's very interesting is, nursing roots have been planted in training people to help the care and wellness of others. In the Victorian age, so that's in the 1800s, nursing education focused on obedience to the physician. But what we found is education about how to nurse was passed on by word of mouth from nurse to nurse or from Indigenous peoples who shared their knowledge about healing. It's like, how in the 1900s, so 1800s, 1900s, how in the 1900s did the Indigenous teach that to nurses when at that time a lot of them were segregated? Well, the answer is World War I. And so there are actually many Indigenous who fought with the Allied troops, and practical nursing learned from these groups of people who otherwise would have been segregated. I think this paper is amazing, and it really talks about how we can incorporate Indigenous learnings and teachings into the classroom and into the modern world. Like really, really cool, relevant paper that I found about this. Great. And so now I'm going to allude to what we're going to talk about. The reason that I want to say it up front is because it's actually extremely dense, and I'm going to have to better define pedagogy, andragogy, pedagogy, some of their shortcomings, and why we need this something called Ubuntugogy, which is an African educational paradigm that transcends all of these ogies. And so this is the Ubuntu logo. This operating system, this Linux operating system I'm using is actually called Ubuntu. Its logo is 3 people in a circle, and it draws from this concept of central shared knowledge, which again comes from the Indigenous of Africa. The paper that I'm referencing has a mostly South African context, but I think what I'm going to do in a lot of the quotes is I'm going to remove Africa completely, as it greatly applies to everybody. So it does have African roots, but it does apply to everyone. So again, take a pause. The next section where I talk about some of the Indigenous philosophies is going to be quite dense, but it actually will have practical strategies that I can use in the technology classroom, and I'm going to outline those. Great. Hopefully you took that break. So let's start. So what is Ubuntu? There are lots of definitions. I like this recent paper, which defines it as transforming us to a greater sense of universal responsibility. And so what does that mean? It means salvation hinges upon employing Indigenous educational paradigms under the rubric of Ubuntugogy, which is defined as the study of teaching and learning. Again, teaching and learning comes together, right? Hand in hand, undergirded by humanity towards others. Teaching and learning of humanity towards other as part of what you're teaching and learning, right? And so it transcends pedagogy, Irnagaji, and Hudagogy. And I will explain what transcension means. But to get into that, I think I have to explain Ubuntology a little bit more, and then some of the shortcomings of each of these. And again, I'm going to quote this paper, and this paper also does a great thing, which is quotes other people. And so I'm going to take the important quotes that I think can directly apply to the classroom. There's lots of other information in this paper. I recommend that you read as well and try to draw connections to your own life. But these are the ones that I could summarize quickly as part of this individual inquiry. And so the first one is we should also promote an education that will acquaint children with real life, not only by giving them vocational training, but closely relating school with life. Life indeed is the true school. And our schools, whether general education or vocational training, should be auxiliaries of life. So it's not just teaching them skills that they can get a job, it's teaching them skills that they can resolve problems that they're going to face in everyday life. Drawing it to where they can use it will help engage students better. A fundamental objective of university must be to safeguard and develop the culture of people it serves. We must work together to study the well springs of our culture, trace its development, mold its future. Everyone comes from different backgrounds, especially in a country such as Canada where it's so multicultural. Everyone can draw from their own backgrounds, understanding our own just like I had to do in the last section, understand its development and mold its future. And we all have the ability to do that. Students feeling partly connected to their own culture and identity will be paramount. And I'll talk about identity also in a little bit and how important it is for mental health. So we took care of community and the community took care of us. We neither needed nor wished to exploit our fellows. So stuff we're doing can relate directly to community. Maybe there are members of the community who can benefit from computer technology, transport, hairstyling, aesthetics. All of the teaching within the technology education program can be directly connected to the community, and we should serve the community, and students should serve the community to understand what benefits they can provide to the community through their learning, which will inspire them and motivate them to want to learn, while enabling them to have good morals and be good global citizens. Back to the inquiry question. So, intellectuals, if they are to play a part in the revolution, they must become conscious of class struggle and align themselves with the oppressed masses. This involves difficult but not impossible task of cutting themselves from bourgeois attitudes and ideologies inhibited by the colonialist education and propaganda. So when students are less focused on marks, grades, competition, they're able to move beyond and focus on how they can basically help others. And Ubuntology and the ology behind it also discusses how to do that, and I'll talk about it. This is my favorite quote in the whole thing, which is, "Teach workers to work, teach thinkers to think. How foolish to ask, what is the best education for 1, or 7, or 60 million souls? Shall we teach them trades, or shall we train them in liberal arts? Neither, and both. Teach the workers to work and the thinkers to think. Make carpenters of carpenters and philosophers of philosophers and flops of fools. Nor can we pause here, for the final product of our training must be neither a psychologist or a brick mason, but a person. And to make people, we must have ideals, broad, pure, and inspiring ends of living, not sordid money getting, not apples of gold. The worker must work for the glory of their handiwork, not simply for money. And thinkers must think for truth, not for fame." And this is huge. We're not just teaching them to go and contribute to society by earning money, but actually by having glory in their handiwork and creating things that others can use and benefits society. And then this is another one, each one, teach one. This comes from the U.S. Slavery movement, where slave owners did not allow slaves to learn to read and held knowledge from them. And so when they learned something, their goal was to teach it to others, and that way everybody can learn. Amazing quote. Another one is, educational system does not need a tune-up, it needs an overhaul. And so what does it mean to have an overhaul? That's kind of where this kind of leads to Ubuntu and Ubuntu-Oji. And to get there, it actually goes to a really dark place. So it talks about life, death, and humanity. And so apologies, we're going to have to get there. And that's kind of what we lead with. I end this with death and what that means. And that death only only after you understand death are you able to understand transcension. So life is holistic. It's based on an integrated worldview. All life is total. All human activities are closely interrelated. This has the underlying principle of the sanctity of the person and their spirituality. So it's again tying actions of people to the collective, being beyond just their community, but also the land, land and the environment. Same teachings of the indigenous before, not just in Africa, as I explained previously. Just to bring it back. What this means is students need to understand that, again, understand that societal context to what they're doing. And this kind of then draws to their own personhood. And the labor of achievements flow from this value system to society. Even personal shortcomings cannot invalidate it. I'm going to read that again. Even personal shortcomings cannot invalidate it. When people make mistakes, when they're unable to accomplish tasks, when they don't find purpose and appreciation in life, that causes a lot of mental health problems and in my opinion, being exposed to suicide and some of these other things is caused by people not understanding where they're benefiting and helping people and others in society. And that's, I think, fundamental to our education system is we have to enable students to gain that identity that they are helping the community, helping society, and it solves a lot of the other identity problems that can occur. And so that's what I really want to bring to the classroom is getting people to understand I'm learning something because I can use it in a way to help everybody else. And by helping everybody else, I'm helping myself. And I think that's a really, really cool and amazing and powerful concept. It's going to be very interesting as I try to implement that within the classroom and evaluate how I'm doing on it. Pause, think, is that possible or usable, within your own practice? The other thing I want to say is talk about good and evil and kind of where that brings us. And so, there's a moral one. There's never a rigid line of good and evil. They're in the same continuum. Whatever is good can also, by its very nature, being good is evil. The greatest strengths are greatest weaknesses. Advantages are disadvantages. And that is in many different cultures. And so there's this concept of survival. And so I think, there's survival, and there's a left and there's a right. Those that are left is survive, and there's right, the right to education. So that allows us to debunk certain, implementations of theories. So this concept of Darwinian survival of the fittest can give license to power groups to exterminate weak ones. We can see that, through colonialism, across the world. But the general concept is that we have moved beyond animals. We are humans and we have humanity. And so in large humanities, and there's the science of humanity, and there's cooperative ways of survival that the entire humanity in the spirit of Ubuntu or humanness. And so that's another definition. I am because we are. And so I like this imagery here. It has definitely African colors. Comes from this blog post. Read the post. It says, the true power of Ubuntu lies in its cross-cultural reliability. You do not need to have stepped foot in Africa to resonate with the principle of shared and mutual reinforcing humanity. And this is collectivism. We talked about that, about the other the circular nature and the other indigenous communities. And so there's also this concept of perfectionism. It's alien to thought. It's a temptation to danger. It's an invitation to arrogance, self-glorification. It fits in the balance between good and evil, and that kind of leads perfectionism to individualism. So it creates rugged competition, and it's come to currently a way of life, and society is regarded as a means to individual ends. So you can basically exploit society to benefit yourself. It's in stark contrast to cooperation, group work, or teamwork. And thinking education prepared the youths for specific responsibilities they're to shoulder as adults. It was education for life and all its complexities and personal needs that allowed growth talents to serve the community where students lived. Again, repeating a lot of what I said in the past, just quoting again the paper. It facilitated the transfer of knowledge from one generation to another. This intergenerational knowledge is this concept of transcension, which again I'm going to get to. But to do that, we need to reform the current education system. And so the general idea is that learning took place from birth until death with the family unit, extended family, and the entire village. Entire village includes ancestors, and that's how we transcend. But before we talk about transcension, let's actually talk about some of the issues with pedagogy. So defined in this paper, again, this is not like my thinking or my opinion. This is what's outlined in the paper. It's literally directly quoted, is an approach to education allegedly based on assumption of student as child, and andragogy as an approach to education based off assumptions as student as adult. So pedagogy attempts to transmit knowledge and culture to children under conditions of compulsory attendance. It's learners who are presumed to not have the means or ability to learn on their own, and is characterized by a relationship of dependency between the teacher and learner, where the latter is most passively taught by and learns from another. So to break this, the teacher has to become the student, and the learner has to become the teacher. They go hand in hand. Again, that goes back to the Indigenous teaching, and learning and teaching is one and the same. And the teacher has to become a learner. How do I implement that in the classroom? Well, I take on my own computer education projects. I take on my other technology education projects. I work on projects. I fail at those projects. I learn from them. Students see me fail. They see me learn, and they learn from me learning. It's this whole concept that I'm joining them in that journey. And by giving up the power that I have and the ego, are they able to then learn, that there is things more important than just themselves, and there is society, and they have to see that by doing, learn by doing while others are doing. And so that's how I'm going. That's a strategy I'm going to use within the classroom. Again, I love this image. If another reminder, read the article if you can. It's really short, great blog post. Talks about the circular game. There are many ways in which I can use it. I'm not going to explain it in this because I want you to read it. But the concept is, there are many applications of circular things within my own curriculum. For example, circuits, literally circular computing processes, feedback loops. Things within the curriculum fall under this paradigm, and it's really, really interesting. I'm going to leave it vague. The circle game is a great strategy to use within the classroom. Okay, let's move on from pedagogy to andragogy, and it's this preference that adults have self-direction. They have to invest in the curriculum based off of their interests and needs. The role of the teacher becomes a facilitator to help the learners and calls for identifying and solving problems in the present, but attempts to pursue concrete goals. So I become a facilitator. I can also become a guide. I can facilitate them, guide them, get them towards learning, which is a really, really cool movement. It allows them to mature and move to adulthood. Generally in Indigenous groups, adulthood occurs much earlier in life, and so that's kind of why there's this transition. In today's day and age, students remain within the formal education system through university. Many of my friends are going from university to college. They remain within that pedagogy system for quite a while, and sometimes struggle to go to andragogy as they move towards the working force. One of the concepts I had and strategies is presence is optional, but attendance is mandatory. Maybe the students have to come to my class, but they don't have to be present emotionally. They have to be physically present. They don't have to be present emotionally or intellectually. It's kind of their choice to engage. And so if I can help them to make that choice to want to engage, is a great strategy. How I would do that is, again, tie things to problems. How can they help their community? How can they learn tools and skills to solve problems that they face in their life? Great. Then moving on, there's hudagogy. So, society's changing. There's information explosion. Learners need to determine how and when and what occurring should learn. That's a concept of hudagogy. It's self-determined learning, and it's the optimal. It was claimed to be the optimal approach for learning in the 21st century. What's interesting is if you look at Indigenous culture, there's this concept of pursuit of consensus and reconciliation. There's democracy, which has discussions. And so there's this hierarchy of people speaking up and coming to agreement. This comes to the classroom because people are going to have different learning styles. They're not going to be motivated. Even though it's called self-motivation, I want to draw again to that final chapter where it talks about, while others are doing, they go on an individual ceremony, but the fact that everyone's on that individual ceremony means that they're all part of it. And so it's the same kind of concept. Self-directed learning is actually learning as a group, which is kind of cool. So we need a central knowledge store. Way I can implement that in the classroom is I can make public course notes. I can put it on something called Git. If you don't know what that is, it allows any student to take what I do, modify it, and then post changes. And everyone can create a version of this knowledge store. Anyone can have access to it. And then I can incorporate some of those other things like skill exchange, peer learning, and other educators to get students, and then that kind of brings to this concept of we are one, unity is strength, and injury to one is injury to all. So if everyone's learning, including the teacher, someone disruptive in class could also, for example, cause problems. And by them injuring everyone, maybe they'll realize that and they'll be able to improve their behavior. I don't need, or the class does not need to police it. And so that kind of leads to the concept that we expose ourselves to others and we encounter differences, and that differences, enrich our own experience. And to be human is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others. And so how can people become self-determined while keeping good morals and being good citizens? It's very easy to be self-determined if there are other motivators, such as financial motivators or power or things that usually corrupt society. How can they actually form good morals and be good citizens? And what are some practical ways I can bring that back to a technology education classroom? The answer is transcending pedagogy, and it really talks about death and passing. So I had my grandparents pass over the last couple years, and in the eulogy I discussed this idea. They didn't pass away, they actually passed on. So they're lived on through the people that they interacted with, including myself. And so that kind of leads to the concept of person as a person through other persons. And the person is to become through other persons is ultimately an ancestor. So when you transcend into the spirit of someone else and the knowledge into someone else, and they apply your teaching and your learnings, you become them and they become you, which I think is explains that concept of transcension, which is like really complicated. And at the start of this inquiry, I had no idea, what that meant. And so the idea is ancestors are extended family. Dying is the ultimate homecoming. But not only must the living and dead share with caring one for another, but the living and dead depend on each other. And so, as promised, I end this individual inquiry on death. And basically what that means, and it's directly applicable to the technology education classroom. And so, the next steps. So I incorporated some philosophies of 3 Indigenous groups. There are a lot of other Indigenous groups that have their own cultures that I don't know about and didn't investigate. Second of all, I can definitely study and interpret folk art, song, dance, and lore much better. It was a very interesting exercise to have to go through that about my own culture. I want to continue to do that, but I also want to continue to evaluate the applications of these philosophies and methods as a teacher. Am I a teacher? Am I a learner? Am I learning new philosophies? Am I continuing to study? Is it effective towards the students and community and world? And really evaluating, going kind of full circle. And that's kind of to be determined. I have a whole life of teaching ahead of me, and again, I want to learn, like, what did you learn from this? Was there anything interesting? Were there things that I missed, or things that I should have discussed, or things that you thought was important? And the rest are just the credits. So this template was made by Slides Go, icons by Flat Icon, infographics and images by Free Pick. All the other images I sourced within, and then I also have my references. If you've reached this far and you're still listening, the bolded references are ones that I think are directly related to teaching, and I think are definitely worth any sort of educator to read. I think it's really cool. And so these are all of my references, and I did try to read a lot of them or read summaries to draw from basically what I presented to you there. And so I really want to learn about like what you guys learned from this talk, and hopefully you found it informative. Thank you.